Good afternoon. I'm Steve Shalom, the director of the Gandhian Forum for Peace and Justice, the organization that is sponsoring this program along with many other organizations on campus. The Gandhian Forum is committed to bringing programs to campus that deal with issues of peace and social justice. And so we've had speakers in the past talking about war, immigration, economic inequality, same-sex marriage, Israel-Palestine, those kinds of issues. And so this past fall, we sat around at our executive board meeting trying to decide, well, okay, what should we deal with this spring for our speaker? And we were batting around a bunch of ideas, and a student on our board said, well, what about sports? And a bunch of the fuddy-duddies on the panel, including myself, said, sports? Social justice issues. And then we said, hey, wait a minute. Sports involves questions of racism, sexism, homophobia, class domination. All these things are social justice issues, and they're tied into sports. That seemed like a plan. So then the question was, who do we get to speak about this? And that was the easy part. There's one person in this country who is really an expert both on sports and on social justice, and that's Dave Zirin. Dave Zirin is the host of Edge of Sports Radio, a radio program. He's a columnist who writes about sports. He's written 7 books about sports, which I know that the provost will tell you could get you tenure here. So this is a really accomplished writer, really knowledgeable, but he also knows and loves sports. So I think that combination should make for a very interesting program. Here's what we're going to do today. Dave is going to speak to us first, and then he's going to welcome questions from you and answer them, and that's going to take place during the Common Hour. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to have a follow-up session in room 101 in this building, 1 floor down, and we'll give you directions later, where we're going to have a panel of students, which will include a student athlete, a former professional football player, and students of sports commenting on Dave's talk, and then he will respond to them. So we invite you, if you can, to be part of both of those sessions. But right now, I'd like to welcome Dave Zirin.
Thank you, Steve. How's everybody doing?
Great.
Okay, cool. All right, okay. Before I start, I just like some sense of the audience. I like doing that before I start. It gives me a sense of who I'm talking to, because sports can be kind of a bit of a broad subject. How many people here consider yourselves like really, really attentive, even psychotic sports fans? Like you're following everything. Okay. How many people here consider yourselves, you're kind of sports fans? You follow what's going on, you know what's happening, but you can live without it. It's a thing. Okay. And how many people would rather shave your head with a cheese grater than hear somebody talk about sports for 90 minutes? Excellent. What's your name, man? Yes? Carol. Okay. So the goal for this talk today is to do something that speaks to the avid sports fan, the casual sports fan, and Carol. And if we can do that, then we'll do some good. Now, I grew up one of those absolutely avid psychotic sports fans, right over in New York City. I mean, I played baseball. I was the starting center for my high school basketball team. We sucked. I'm not tall. I pretty much played every sport but golf, which of course is not a sport. This is one of my little things I believe strongly, is that anything you can gain weight or smoke cigarettes while doing is not a sport. So that's an important principle that I hold dear. And I never gave much thought about sports being political in any kind of way, or that sports being a window into understanding this country or understanding some of the issues that Professor Shalom raised. But I did have a sense that there was something bigger in sports than just sports, and that really came home to me in 1996. I was in college, and there was a basketball player for the Denver Nuggets named Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf, And he made the private decision that he wasn't going to come out for the national anthem before games. Now, this was a huge deal at the time. And it became even bigger when a beat writer for the Nuggets went into the locker room and asked Abdul Rauf why he wasn't doing it. And he said, "Why aren't you going out there for the national anthem? Don't you realize that that flag is a symbol of freedom and democracy throughout the world?" And I'll tell you, you can go on YouTube and see this interview. It's really interesting because Rauf has this sort of look on his face like, should I say something? I think I'm going to say something. And he says, well, it may be a symbol of freedom and democracy to some, but it's a symbol of oppression and tyranny to others. Now, when he said this, the sports world went absolutely bananas. I mean, I'll never forget, these are pre-internet times, so we're like running home in college to the dorm to watch on TV how it was going to be discussed on Sports Center, and it was like, Rauf spits on the flag, booyah, din-in-it, din-in-it, and we're just like watching so attentively about what's going to happen next. And I'll never forget, one of the commentators on ESPN said, Rauf must see himself in the tradition of activist athletes, people like Muhammad Ali, Billie Jean King, Tommy Smith, and John Carlos. And I remember that for me was like a key life-changing moment, because I thought I was somebody who knew something about sports. I mean, I had statistics memorized. I still had my old baseball cards, memorizing batting averages. And I had no idea that there was this other history, that there was this history of this thing called activist athletes. And I went to the library. I started reading about it. And I mean, it was actually really hard to find, like, serious articles about the history of sports and politics and the ways in which they intersected. Oftentimes you had to go back and read memoirs of people like Bill Russell, or go back and read the old Sport magazine to see this kind of in-depth coverage. But you didn't really have like the comprehensive books about it. And then I said, okay, well, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to try to synthesize these different instances where athletes have used that hyper-exalted, brought to you by Nike platform to say something about the world. And as I was studying it, I realized that most of what I thought I knew about sports, which was like a very generic sports history, was actually something that was rife with lies and misinformation. One of the most basic examples is I had thought that Jackie Robinson was the first African-American to play Major League Baseball. I was born in Brooklyn, my dad raised in Brooklyn. That's always what I was taught. And then yet when you study it, you see that while Jackie Robinson did break the color line in Major League Baseball in 1947, there were actually African Americans who played Major League Baseball in the 19th century. And in fact, all of sports were integrated when they first began in the mid-late 19th century after the Civil War. And it was only after the establishment of Jim Crow laws in the South in the 1870s and 1880s that you saw people of color systematically pushed out of sports in this country. Like, for example, not only were there African Americans who played in early forms of Major League Baseball back then, but at the first Kentucky Derby, which was in 1875, 16 of the 17 jockeys were black. By 1890, it was all white. So in that 15-year period, you have this seismic change. I mean, they adopted laws that were so precise about preventing people of color and Caucasians from mixing in sports, that laws were enacted in the South that legalized dogfighting, legalized a sport called bear baiting, where you would sick your dogs on a bear and you would bet on who would win. But they made it illegal for, say, a black person to own the dog and a white person to own the bear. So you could have these sports that involved a lot of, like, animal brutality, things today that would be abhorrent to us. That was seen as okay, but you couldn't have, quote-unquote, race mixing as part of sports. So learning that absolutely blew my mind. Of course, there was one sport that did stay integrated in this time. Anybody want to guess what that was?
Football.
Not football, but close. Boxing, that's right. It was boxing. But football's got its own very interesting history with that. We could even get back to that in Q&A. But the boxing part is really interesting. And it's not because the people who ran boxing were the Quakers or anything. I mean, it was because they saw that they could make money by pitting a white fighter versus a black fighter and let the money roll in. But we're going to get ahead of ourselves there. Let's go back to Jackie Robinson, because the other thing I thought I knew about Jackie Robinson, and this will be very familiar for people. How many people here saw the movie 42 that came out? Be very familiar to 42, but to people who've seen 42, but I saw the Jackie Robinson narrative as one of a player who, quote unquote, did it the right way, which was code for saying that he kept his mouth shut, he worked his butt off, he took all kinds of abuse and threats of violence, and through his own individual greatness, persevered, and that's what laid the groundwork for not just integration in Major League Baseball, but the civil rights movement that took place the next decade. Now, the actual truth, though, was that Jackie Robinson was somebody who believed strongly in the idea that, and he spoke about this a great deal at the end of his life, that his individual accomplishments should not obscure the fact that the general situation in the country in terms of race relations was something that no one should look at with pride. In fact, he was a barnstorming speaker for civil rights in the late 1950s. He was the most requested speaker by southern branches of the NAACP. In other words, when people wanted a speaker, their first choice was Jackie Robinson. The number 2 choice, according to the NAACP's own records, was someone you might have heard of named Dr. Martin Luther King. And I always found that funny, because you imagine people trying to organize a meeting like you described, or organizing this forum, and somebody says, okay, can we get Jackie Robinson? Oh, he's busy. All right, let's get Dr. King. Darn it. You know, like he would be the second choice for these organizing bodies. But that really was the truth. That was his power. And he would always end his speeches the same way. He would say, if I had to choose tomorrow between the Baseball Hall of Fame and full citizenship for my people, I would choose full citizenship time and again. And that would just bring the house down. And Jackie Robinson, the person who today is talked about in such a sainted light, he actually received an incredible amount of criticism for making speeches like this in the late 1950s. It was said that he was tarnishing his own legacy by speaking out for civil rights in the most mainstream liberal newspapers you can imagine, because he was mixing politics and sports, and that was a great sin. And Martin Luther King actually spoke about this. He made a whole speech defending Jackie Robinson. Once again, this is something that you have to dig to find, but it's a beautiful speech where he said, Jackie Robinson has earned every right to speak out because he was a sit-inner before sit-ins, a freedom rider before freedom rides. Now, if Jackie Robinson was an athlete who in so many ways defined and shaped the social conflicts of the 1950s, then the person who stands for that, certainly in the 1960s, was, the person who said, I hospitalized a rock, I beat up a brick, I'm so bad I make medicine sick. Now, who's that? Muhammad Ali, that's right, Ali. And, I talk about Muhammad Ali a lot. I mean, I write, like Professor said, I've written 7 books about sports and politics. I think 3 of them have Muhammad Ali on the cover in some way, shape, or form, because there's no more sort of like emblematic figure who really personifies that collision of sports and politics. And yet, when I speak to audiences about him today, particularly young people, the toughest part is trying to make people realize just how hated he was in the 1960s. That's a very hard thing to do, because he really has become something akin to a walking saint today, and it's very rare that you hear him discussed in a way that's not with abject praise. And the thing that I try to get across to people first and foremost is that when Muhammad Ali was Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., it's 1960, he's 18 years old, he's winning a gold medal. He did not have a political bone in his body at that time. He is somebody who, if you had asked him what his dream was, he would have said his dream was to bring the showmanship of professional wrestling into boxing. And if you'd asked him who his hero was, he would not have said Dr. King, he would not have said Malcolm X, he would have said a wrestler named Gorgeous George Wagner, who, if you know anything about pro wrestling, you know who Gorgeous George was. He was somebody who was like this very flamboyant person who would try to make the crowd as angry as possible. And yet he was also a political lightning rod, even though he was not thinking about politics, because in 1960, he was also someone who was completely not shy about telling the world how pretty he was and telling the world that he was the greatest. Now, this sounds like, something that maybe, Terrell Owens would say today, or Johnny Manziel, it's like, oh, I'm the greatest, or whatever, and you don't give it a second thought, because that's becomes so much a part of athletic speech. Not all athletes, but a lot of athletes, the hype machine. But back then, it was so different to see an African-American athlete, first of all, talk about how pretty they were. In a time years before the phrase "black is beautiful" became something that was like a slogan of anti-racism in this country, but also for him to talk about how great he was and to not be shy about that. So I say all that because you have to understand that already you had the most prominent newspaper writers in the country referring to him as the Louisville Lip, Cash the Brash, or my personal favorite was Gaseous Cassius, is what they would call him. So he was already somebody who was on nobody's happy list in terms of the athletes of the 20th century. So much so that the sporting press, actually it was 50 years ago just last week, but one of the most famous fights in history was when he won the title against Sonny Liston, the big ugly bear in Miami Beach. And the overwhelming majority of the sporting press was rooting for Sonny Liston over Cassius Clay in this fight. And so things were pretty electric already around this young man. And then things got even more electric the week after the fight, when he announced to the world that his name was Muhammad Ali and he'd become a member of the Nation of Islam. Now, once again, this is one of those things where it's trying to get people to understand how absolutely wild this was in the context of 1964 America. Because you have the heavyweight champion of the world. It's already bad enough that the heavyweight champion, who's supposed to emblemize this kind of exquisite, masculinity, is telling people how pretty he is. Already, problems. But then on top of that, to join an organization like the Nation of Islam, it marked what a writer named Mike Marcusy calls the three rejections. Because the Nation of Islam was an organization that did not believe in integration. It believed in black nationalism, it believed in separation, and it believed unapologetically that white people were devils. I mean, so you imagine that for a second, about the heavyweight champion of the world, the most famous athlete in the country, taking these opinions. It was what Mike Marcusy, he called it the three rejections. So it's the rejection of integration, the idea that there's an American ideal that says that it's in the best interest of everyone to live amongst each other. It's a rejection of America, because it's part of the religion of the Nation of Islam was about Pan-Africanism and joining with people of color in other countries and not, for example, fighting for the United States Army. And so integration, Americas, and it was a rejection of Christianity, which, that doesn't seem like such a big deal now, but in early 1960s America, to say publicly, as he would, I ain't no Christian, damn the white man's money. To say those things as a professional athlete, it cannot be expressed about how big a deal that was at the time. And of course, I want to give an example here. I was about to say, of course, that the fight world, the writers, they lost their mind. And I have an advantage of having this little thing right here, so I can pull out a quote without having to remember it. This was said by a person who was arguably the most famous sports writer at that time. His name was Jimmy Cannon. Him and Red Smith were like the two people who were the most famous sports writers of their day. And this is how he described Muhammad Ali. First of all, he calls him Clay, because that was the policy of most newspapers, including the New York Times, that they had policies against calling him Muhammad Ali as an editorial policy. He said, Clay fits in with the famous singers no one can hear, and the punks riding motorcycles, and Batman. The Batman thing confuses me. And the boys with their long, dirty hair, and the girls with the unwashed look, and the college kids dancing naked at secret proms. It wasn't my college, I don't know. And the revolt of students who get a check from dad, and the painters who copy the labels off soup cans, and surf bums who refuse to work, and the whole pampered cult of the bored young. So you see what's going on there. It's not just that Muhammad Ali is this person who talks too much. It's that he actually represents a whole generation. And not just African Americans either, but a whole generation of young people who aren't doing things the way the older generation had done it, which was so emblemized in perhaps his most famous quote, arguably, where he said, reporters were asking him, why are you joining the Nation of Islam? Why are you joining? And he said, I don't have to be who you want me to be. And that was something that found itself on posters and in dorm rooms, just that phrase, I don't have to be what you want me to be. And he really cemented himself, though, as this lightning rod of the 1960s, of course, when he refused to fight in Vietnam. And he was actually sentenced, this is another thing, like letting people know this, he was sentenced to 5 years in a federal prison, sentenced to 5 years in Leavenworth, and he only didn't serve time because he got out on appeal after it was gotten to the Supreme Court. So here he is, the most famous athlete on earth, his title is taken away from him, and it's 1968, and instead of going into hiding, instead of really cowering in the face of all of these pressures, he actually went on a college speaking tour. And in 1968, it's estimated he spoke on roughly 200 colleges over the course of that year. And you think about that, that's 4 colleges a week. I mean, he had to do that because he needed the money. But, I mean, his family was going bankrupt. He'd even been pushed away by the Nation of Islam at that time because they were nervous that he was getting too much attention at this point. So he was really a man on an island with just himself and his wife, Khalila, and a couple of close friends. And there he was, though, going from college to college, doing speeches in front of students from historically black colleges to Harvard and Princeton, just going out there and speaking to people. And I want to read a little bit from one of the speeches that he said, because once again, it's like you have to think to yourself, all right, this is a very famous athlete with a huge platform speaking about the Vietnam War. And it gives you an idea about why he was so polarizing. He said, "Why should they ask me to put on a uniform and go 10,000 miles from home and drop bombs and bullets on brown people in Vietnam while so-called Negro people in Louisville are treated like dogs and denied simple human rights? No, I'm not going 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of the masters of the world over. This is a day when such evils must come to an end. I've been warned that to take such a stand will cost me millions of dollars, but I've said it once and I'll say it again. The real enemy of my people is here. I have nothing to lose by standing up for my beliefs, so I'll go to jail. So what? We've been in jail for 400 years. Now, there's been a lot of debate about how much this actually mattered. And there are a couple of recently been some like revisionist history books to say that Muhammad Ali's influence has been greatly overstated. And I would just make 2 very quick responses to that are worth, actually 3, which are worth just thinking about. The first was that Nelson Mandela, who of course just passed away and who was a boxer himself in his youth, said that one of his things that kept him going when he was in isolation on Robben Island was hearing about Muhammad Ali's latest fights. And there was actually a prison pipeline that had been developed so he could get information on what happened in Ali's fights and what was happening with his court case and how he was doing. And this was like actually, and he has this amazing quote Mandela does about hearing about every punch Ali threw was like a punch against the walls of the prison. And it made me feel a little more free. So that's one thing. I mean, it inspired Nelson Mandela. The other story, which to me is so affecting, has to do with Martin Luther King Jr. himself. Because Martin Luther King Jr., like Muhammad Ali, like Malcolm X, is another person who's been kind of sanctified with time. Like somebody whose political teeth, he's gotten like a political root canal over the decades. And one of the things about Martin Luther King that we forget now is that when he came out against the war in Vietnam, he was criticized mercilessly for it, even by other people in the civil rights movement. It was seen as something that he should not do. It was not his place. He should focus on civil rights and not speak about what's happening in other countries. And one of the points that Martin Luther King made at his first press conference where he was explaining why he was against the war in Vietnam is he referenced Muhammad Ali. And he said, well, it's like Muhammad Ali says, all of these things are connected. And so you think about that for a second. Like here he is, this is Martin Luther King, for goodness sakes, Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he points to Muhammad Ali as a source of inspiration. I mean, that's a remarkable thing. And then the third thing about Muhammad Ali and who he inspired is that he inspired one of the most famous athletic moments in history, which was the 1968 Olympics, where Tommy Smith and John Carlos raised their fist on the medal stand in Mexico City. Just show of hands of people who are familiar with that image, so I can just assume that. Okay, great. Yeah, I wrote John Carlos, his memoir, with him. He was the bronze medalist there who raised his fist, and so I lived that moment with John and relived it. And one of the things that we wrote about in the book that John said is that everybody knows that moment when they raised their fist, but few people know that it was a movement called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. And the Olympic Project for Human Rights was a movement that had 4 demands. One of the demands was to disinvite South Africa and Rhodesia from the Olympic Games because they were apartheid countries. One of the demands was to get Avery Brundage fired as head of the International Olympic Committee because he was an open, proud, racist and anti-Semite. I mean, pretty much anything bad you can say was Avery Brundage. They wanted more African-American assistant coaches hired, and they wanted Muhammad Ali's title restored. And they called him the warrior saint of the black athletes' revolt. So Ali's influence had a ripple effect that's really, I mean, it's like the old civil rights metaphor that King would use about throwing a stone in a pond and we don't take account for the ripples. I mean, the ripples of Muhammad Ali, I think, were actually still reckoning with. Now, obviously, I think very strongly that sports is an incredible lens to tell the history of race and racism in the United States, that if you could actually do an entire course about understanding the history of race and racism in the U.S. by looking at sports. And I didn't even get to issues of Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans. I mean, they're just fascinating histories and tapestries about the different ways in which sports was used as forms of resistance, as forms of connection, as forms of acculturation, all the rest of it. But before I get the hook here, I do want to talk about how the degree to which sports is also an incredible way to understand the history of women in this country and the history of sexism in the United States. I mean, because when organized sports started in this country, it was something that women were just denied. I mean, not all women. Wealthy women had access to this newfangled thing that we're developing called country clubs. But at country clubs, they really had only really 3 sports that they could do. One was golf, which, as we discussed, not a sport. One was horseback riding, and one was tennis. Now, tennis deserves some particular attention right here, because playing tennis in the 19th century for a woman, not fun. I mean, because one of the mandatory uniforms that they had to wear were corsets. Now, I know what a corset is. Like, you saw the movie Titanic, it's like, ugh, with every pull. Now, you ever wonder why men's tennis is best of 5 sets and women's tennis is best of 3? I mean, the roots of it go to the corset, because it actually, women's tennis, if you go back, look at the first Wimbledon and whatnot, it actually was best of 5 sets. And yet women were starting to pass out on the court because of the inability to breathe. And the people who ran Wimbledon got together and they discussed this. And they said, what should we do? Should we get rid of the corsets? And they said, no, let's keep the corsets, but let's make it best of 3 sets instead of best of 5. Less chance of people dying. All right, good, now we're all happy. And that's actually the reason why it's best of 3 sets and not best of 5. And this continued until the 1920s, when a 15-year-old won Wimbledon. Her name was Lottie Dodd. People can look her up. And Lottie Dodd got a corset exemption. Like, she was able to wear her school uniform. And afterwards, she was somewhat embarrassed that she was able to beat superior competition, because, as she said publicly, she said, it would have been such a better tournament if my opponents had been able to breathe. And that plus other changes that were happening in this country in the 1920s led to a kind of shaming that had them change the rules. But this was the rules of that time, was that for women, it was something that they were just denied. And this is something that you see throughout the 20th century until Title IX becomes law. And we just recently passed the 40th anniversary of Title IX legislation becoming law. And for people who don't know what Title IX was, it was signed by Richard Nixon, and it was a law that said that women had equal access to men in all public facilities. And yet its impact is most known through sports. Before Title IX was passed, it was estimated that roughly of course this is according to the Women's Sports Foundation, roughly 1 out of 34 young women played sports. That's women under the ages of 16, 1 out of 34. Now it's 1 out of 3. So you're talking about a huge difference in terms of just the sheer numbers of young women who play sports. And according to the Women's Sports Foundation, young girls who play sports before the ages of 12, less likely to have eating disorders, less likely to have addictions to drugs and alcohol, less likely to teen pregnancy. I mean, all of these issues are mediated by sports, by the presence of sports. And it's stunning. It's really actually difficult to think of a piece of legislation since 1970 that's had the kind of widespread impact that Title IX has. So obviously, one of the reasons why I find this stuff interesting, and I think anybody who's been conscious over the last 6 months knows, is that to me this is a living history. I find it so interesting to learn about people like Billie Jean King, people like Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, because what they did was they laid a groundwork for athletes today. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And you see a lot of rhyming today, for example, with Jason Collins becoming the first openly gay player in one of the big North American sports. and the issues that he's dealing with. No, it's not the same as Jackie Robinson, but there are things that it recalls and questions that it recalls that are the same. Or Michael Sam, who's aiming to become the first NFL player who's out of the closet. Or what we just saw in Sochi, with athletes trying to figure out a way to be heard in the context of the Olympic Games and speak out, and largely failing to do so, despite the fact that many of them spoke beforehand, as Billie Jean King put it, of trying to have a quote-unquote John Carlos moment. So it's like, what does it mean to have a John Carlos moment? Well, you have to know something about John Carlos. You have to know something about 1968. You have to know something about what he sacrificed and what he gained by speaking out. So in all of these ways, like, knowing this history is very important because it informs so much about what's happening now in the world of sports. And I do ascribe very strongly to the words of one of my heroes, who's a historian named Howard Zinn, who said that I study history not because I want to learn more about the past, but because I want to change the future. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to take any questions that people have. And it doesn't have to be about anything I said either. So people can ask about whatever they like.
Do you think it's exploitation for football players to have to wait 3 years before they can make money playing football? They can't turn pro right out of high school. Basically, universities are able to make hundreds of millions of dollars off them, but they can't make money off their own talents.
Yeah, I mean, once again, like, this is that's a great question, and this is a great issue. The question of the NCAA is like a live political issue that runs through sports. And earlier this year, the Northeastern football team, people might know this, became the first football team at a Division I school to organize themselves into a union. And they submitted their papers with the National Labor Relations Board, and they're looking for recognition. No, I think that the way the NCAA is run stinks to high heaven. And whether or not players should have to wait 3 years before entering the NFL is to me a secondary question to the fact that the college system needs to be reformed dramatically. And it's a different system. Even when I was growing up, it's very different. Like, for example, Woody Hayes, who's a famous Ohio State coach, his last year coaching, which was in the early 1980s, I think it was 82, 80, 81, 82. His last year coaching, he made $42,000. Today, the coach at Ohio State, Urban Meyer, makes a base salary of $4 million. So the system has changed. A $6 billion deal was signed with ESPN to broadcast the NCAA new football playoff format. $6 billion. So it's like everything has changed in the system in and of itself. Assistant coaches, there used to be a cap on what assistant coaches could make. Now, a top assistant at a top school will make $1 million. I mean, so while the system has changed so much in terms of TV, in terms of revenue, in terms of fame, in terms of what's asked of the players, what's remained the same is the position of the college athlete themselves. And that position is still, at schools, 1-year scholarships that are renewed annually. So anytime someone says to you, they get a 4-year education, that's not true. It's a 1-year ride that gets renewed on an annual basis. You could have a 4.0 GPA, and if you're not, making the coach happy, or if a new coach comes in, you're going to find yourself somewhere else. And we haven't even discussed the medical issues as well. Like, you get hurt on the field, are you able to go back to school? Will there be an opportunity for you to continue your education? I mean, these pitfalls are all over the place, and it's hard to see. This is what the Northwestern players are saying, is that it's hard to see how, this is a moral structure when players don't have a seat at the table. And I think what we're seeing now for the first time, really, maybe ever, is players figuring out a way to organize against it. And it was kind of inevitable that it would happen. I mean, when you have coaching salaries as high as they are. I mean, the craziest thing is, like, at some schools, like, you could pay players and they would be the equivalent of campus employees, and you would have money to do that if you just eliminated the compliance department at the school, which at some schools is hundreds of thousands of dollars a year of offices just to make sure that you're NCAA compliant. Because the rule book is like this. I mean, the most famous NCAA rule that gets mocked the most but is so, says so much is the idea that, if you serve bagels to a recruit and it's butter, that's okay, but if it's cream cheese, it's a violation of NCAA rules. And I'll never forget, this rule book is so crazy. It's bigger than like the healthcare bill, for goodness sakes. Like I remember asking the coach at Maryland, Randy Edsall, the football coach, I asked him if he'd ever committed NCAA violations, and his answer was, he said, I'm sure I'm committing some right now and don't even know it. And they pay people at some schools hundreds of thousands of dollars just to make sure that they're NCAA compliant. And so people are like, well, where would be the money for these athletes? And it's like the money is everywhere. The question is the prioritization of that money and how it's used. And I'll just go, I'm going to gender it, so I'll get to you in 1 second. Yes?
Speaking gender.
Oh, is this Carol, by the way?
Yes.
Was this okay, by the way?
This is okay.
Okay, good. Just checking.
I'm still not going to watch these.
No. Wasn't going for that.
Okay, good. I agree with you. But would you talk about the culture of sexual violence in male sports, male-dominated sports?
Yeah, and I just, I write about this a lot because there's been a lot of very high-profile cases in the last year. Steubenville, Ohio, we were talking beforehand, and in Maryville as well, Torrington, Connecticut, and a couple of cases recently involving current and former NFL players involving the issue of violence against women. And one of the things that I just wrote about was wondering why the NFL doesn't do more, whether it's in terms of public service announcements, whether it's in terms of education, whatever it could be, to actually just raise awareness about violence against women. But they avoid it like it's a third rail of some kind or another, which is interesting because while people in the NFL, like the recent Richie Incognito, Jonathan Martin bullying in the locker room, people might be familiar with, the line from the NFL about that was, this is not typical of our locker rooms, but it even happening once is one time too many. And so we're going to have new regulations, new guidelines. They saw it as what it is, which is a public relations nightmare, to have this kind of window into what happens in NFL locker rooms be so exposed. And I have to tell you, like, according to an ESPN poll, 60% of fans believe that behavior was something that took place in every locker room. But every NFL player who I interviewed said that they'd never heard of things like what was going on in that locker room. So I'll take a lot of them at their word that it was atypical or that it was particularly bad and that Richie Incognito is a particular kind of person and it was a particular kind of culture. But it said to me what's so illustrative is that was seen as even once is one time too many. And yet when it comes to violence against women, it's like see no evil, hear no evil. And I think that what are the reasons behind that? Well, one thing is that I think it's so endemic. I mean, this is why we talk about Steubenville, which of course was a high school, Torrington, which is a high school, Maryville, which was a high school, all involving rape or sexual violence and involving sports teams. And by the way, there's a recent story that just came out of the horrific accused rape in Ottawa, Canada, among the hockey team. So I don't in any way want to say that this is just a football problem, but I think it's an issue of men's team sports. And my own experience with sports and my own experience covering sports says to me that there develops a kind of a pack mentality that sees women as kind of the spoils of being a successful athlete. And it doesn't have to be that way, but it takes a coach or authority figures or role models or team leaders stepping in and really being very deliberate about saying we're not going to be that kind of team. We're not going to talk about people that way. We're not going to treat women that way. And without that kind of direct interventionist involvement, it can get somewhere very bad very quickly. Because the Steubenville story, to me, says so much because that's one we got so many details about. And when we talk about what's called rape culture in sports, it's not the crime. It's the fact that in Steubenville, 50, 60 people, boys and girls, men and women, saw what was happening and saw this woman being dragged, saw her being carried, and chose not to say anything or do anything. Like, that's the culture. That doesn't mean everybody's a rapist, but it means that there's a lot of see no evil, hear no evil. And so I think what's happening in the NFL, in other words, it doesn't start in the NFL at all. Like, it's much more organic than that. But you would like to see, given the fact that the commissioner, Roger Goodell, speaks a lot about the importance of role models and speaks a lot about the importance of actually exemplifying, as he puts it, like the best in America. You know, it's like that he would say, okay, even if this exists in the high school and the college level, the NFL is going to be where it ends. And, yes, sir.
Give me the example that you talked about how much that the actual NCAA compliance departments of actual universities expend on making sure they are compliant. What do you feel, is a real cost-benefit analysis given things that have transpired in the past, such as Peter Ward, Florida State, Reggie Bush, USC, and even most recently, 2 years ago, Penn State, Jerry Sandusky?
Yeah, it's a deep question. I mean, actually, can I give you the mic to, and also maybe say a little something about some of those examples, because I know them, but Peter Warwick might not.
Well, back in 1996, 1995, Peter Warwick was actually found to be violating NCAA compliance rules for accepting some form of payment for a job that he did not do or supposedly had done. That was one of the books that he was paid for. And also Reggie Bush had received some type of financial payments or whatever for going ahead and going to USC. And most recently, Jerry Sandusky and the implications of what he was involved with the football program at Penn State and their basically death sentence to Penn State for his involvement with the football program, of which he was not actually an employee at that time. And my question was, given the cost-benefit analysis of what he just exemplified in terms of what these universities expend on NCAA compliance, what are your thoughts on their actual ability to do their job as much as it's spent on what they are supposed to be doing?
Right. No, it's a great question. I mean, when you think about, there's that old expression about the criminal justice system's like a magical net that catches minnows while the whales go free. And it's like the NCAA compliance system is great. Like Oklahoma just got written up for serving too much pasta to recruits, because it was actually written like how much pasta is too much. And then we have like crimes of a much more serious nature that go unseen. I mean, I think that it's like, of course, anytime you have any kind of system, particularly one that involves young people, particularly one that involves avenues for exploitation, that you need to have some set of rules in order, some set of guidelines. Who can and cannot interact with these players? What can they or can they not pay them? The questions of agents, all of these things. Like, I'm not in any way saying it's not complicated, but the thing that gets to me about it, though, as complicated as it is that the current system is built on a moral foundation that's so shaky that there's no agreed upon code. Like, so you'll have coaches who say openly, yeah, players should be getting paid. You have other coaches who will turn their backs when money does get spent because they feel that morally the players have the right to something because they're making $5 million. You've got other coaches who are absolute hard asses. You've got assistants and trainers and all these people who all view the system in a way that has like one eyebrow up. And unless you have a system that has some sort of, like, it's almost like the center will not hold. Unless you have a system that there's a generally agreed upon set of values and beliefs that everyone's going to stand with, I mean, it's just not going to work. And I think the NCAA, one thing about them is that, particularly in the wake of Northwestern organizing this union, is that they see that. And so, and one of the things, though, that compelled the Northwestern players to organize a union is the NCAA at their last big convention said basically that we realize the center will not hold. We realize we need to figure out a new way of doing this. And so we've appointed this committee that's going to talk about it. And they didn't have one player representative on this committee. And that's when the Northwestern players were just like, wow, this is going to just continue with us being at the bottom of the heel of this system unless we organize ourselves because nobody's listening to us. And if for people who like learning video or visually or what have you, look up the name Kane Coulter, Kain Coulter. He's the quarterback for the Northwestern team. His interviews that he's done about why they're doing a union are brilliant. So if you want to be inspired either by a young person who should be running this country, or if you just want to, see something and learn from him, highly recommended. I see. Oh, first back there and then up here.
I'd love to hear your thoughts about the recent allegations that approximately 70% of the Division I athletes at UNC are illiterate or not attaining at the appropriate academic level.
Yeah, are people familiar? What?
Business Week had a couple.
Yes. Yeah. The Business Week cover story is absolutely devastating. What's been going on at UNC also involves a lot of issues with professors getting players through their program, getting them good grades without them having to study. And I mean, unfortunately, it's like when you hear about this, the first instinct that most people have is, why don't we hear more about these kinds of stories? And because nobody seriously thinks this is just UNC at all. And I think that this is another example, though, of what happens when you have a system where you have people who are basically college employees who are then also asked to be students at the same time and fulfill this role of the student athlete, which I'll never forget. I interviewed a guy named Laron Profit, former All-American for the University of Maryland, and he said to me that, they call us student athletes, but we're really at best athlete students, because as soon as we go on campus, it's made very clear to us like what we're supposed to do and what our priorities are supposed to be. I mean, I've interviewed players who are former NBA players, who are incredibly bright, who graduated college with very good grades, and even in those cases, they have stories of assistant coaches going to their dorm room and saying to them, you don't have to do that, as they're studying. And basically, so it's not saying to them, put that book down and run 5 miles, but it's like a culture at a lot of big-time schools that says you don't have to do that. You don't have to keep up. You don't have to be on grade level. And I got to tell you, like, when I was 18, if an adult authority figure had told me I didn't have to study, I might have had a book bonfire in the middle of my dorm room, because I just would not have had that discipline to say, no, I'm here to learn. No, it's like, no, I'm at college because I'm 18 and I'm supposed to go to college because I don't want to live in my mom's house after high school. You know what I'm saying? So that's how a lot of people are when they get to college. And a lot of players, if they're given that opportunity, and to also, oh my God, like when you have coaches say to them very directly things like, no, this is like a training program for you to go to the pros, and that's where you're going to make your money. So the education itself becomes something that gets debased in that process. And there are players, I don't know how they do it, frankly. Given the demands and given the year-round nature of big-time college sports, like it really is a mystery to me how a lot of players do it. But there are some who do, but many who do not. And if you're a school like UNC, which is one of the best state colleges in the United States, you have to figure out a way to keep your campus employees working on the field. So it's troubling to say the least, but I'm for anything that opens people's eyes and starts discussions about the actual nature of how some of this operates. And then, yes.
First a comment and then a question. And my comment piggybacks on what Carol had to say, because I think as long as coaches of men's teams continue to hold players who aren't doing what the coach expects, terms like pussies, whips, girls, using them as put-downs, that reminds the players that the females are subordinate, and that I think is part of what perpetuates the rape culture in a lot of the sports teams. In terms of my question, I'd like to hear your comments on the media's persistence in not giving adequate coverage to women's sports. I'm thinking specifically of the New York Times, Sports Center, and I'm thinking of Sports Illustrated. In terms of how little coverage, in spite of the fact that so many women are participating in sports, including trying to, at least in professional sports, and a difficult struggle, especially when it comes to women's football and basketball. The WNBA continues to struggle to survive.
Yeah, I mean, that's the second part of that. I mean, is a huge question. They just I just interviewed Mary Jo Kane, who runs the Tucker Center for Women's Sports at the University of Minnesota. It's the only academic center, think tank of its kind, and I really want to recommend going to their website, the Tucker Center, because they just put out a terrific video about women in sports and media, and the percentages are really stunning, because like there's less coverage devoted to women's sports on a typical, say, Sports Center broadcast or nightly newscast. There's less coverage now, percentage-wise, than 10 years ago. And there was less coverage 10 years ago than there was 20 years ago. And so it's like sometimes we confuse history as being this sort of like march of progress when it's actually the reverse is the case. I mean, historically, women's sports has always been a social question, and there is more coverage of women's sports when there are more instances of women demanding equal rights in society as a whole. Because the idea of sports being taken seriously, that's a very kind of sacred idea in the American mindset, like taking sports seriously. And if you're going to take sports seriously, you have to take the people who are actually playing the sports seriously. And unfortunately, in a overwhelmingly male-dominated media, and that far too often in the 21st century prioritize women who look a certain way, who pose also on the cover of Maxim magazine or Playboy's Women of the Olympics issue, then it becomes something where the athletes themselves are taken less seriously. And this was something that Mary Jo Kane at the Tucker Center, they did this amazing field study where they said, we're going to answer this question once and for all. Like this question of, does sex sell women's sports? We're going to answer this because this has been a debate that's raged in women's sports. Like if you're going to sell women's sports, do you have to have really attractive women athletes? Like does Anna Kournikova have to be a tennis star for people to watch women's tennis? And they did these mass surveys, and they talked to hundreds and hundreds of people, and what they came out with their data was that while, say, Danica Patrick, for example, being on the cover of Maxim magazine and answering questions like, are there times of the month when you're a more cranky driver, which was one of the questions they asked her in the interview. It's like that is very good at selling Danica Patrick, and it's very good at selling Maxim magazine, but it actually turns people off from consuming women's sports. It turns their consumption patterns when women athletes are objectified. It makes them less likely to want to watch it and engage with it. And the reasons for that are not, like when they dug deep in the data, they realized the reasons for it really aren't complicated. Because the most avid consumers of women's sports are, first of all, women, big surprise. And as you said, the percentages of women who play sports and have, for example, Division I scholarships has never been higher. And the second group of people who consume women's sports are men with daughters who get very uncomfortable bringing their daughters to events if it's sculpted around the idea of selling sex, which is probably a whole different discussion about how men relate to their daughters, but still, it goes to the general question, though, about why coverage is so low, why it's taken less seriously than it should be. And I saw another. Yes? You have to talk loud, though.
How do you think it affects players that level of success when it comes to things that they can and cannot say? Do you think that elevates them or humanizes them? Because there are times where it does have an impact in some Europe. There are other times they can fall from saying something that is not actually politically correct, or maybe correct, but it's not popular view. So what do you think that success and that spotlight does to the things they say?
No, that's a great question. And if I did an even longer Muhammad Ali talk, I could tell you about all the times he said stuff that would make you cringe, and things that are not exactly things we remember well at all, like calling Joe Frazier a big ugly gorilla and all the rest of it. And so it's like oftentimes, it's like the spotlight giveth and the spotlight taketh away. But I would argue that that's one of the things that makes it so electric when an athlete speaks out. George Clooney could say something tomorrow about the environment. Angelina Jolie could say something about refugees, and you'd sort of roll your eyes and be like, okay, Hollywood person, what have you. They'll be making movies till they're 70, 80 years old. But an athlete, I think, we get that when they speak out, they're actually risking something. It's like they have less individual power over their ability to continue their craft. Typical NFL player on average plays 3.5 years, and it's actually, that doesn't surprise people, but it's actually not much longer for the NFL or the NBA or the NHL. I mean, we're talking 5, 6, 7-year careers, and so there's this very narrow window where they have to really make as much as they can, and that's going to be the most money probably they will make in their entire lives. And so for an athlete in that moment to say, you know what, the heck with being a brand, I'm going to try to actually say something about the world, then it actually has a real ricochet effect, and it matters. So, for example, when the Miami Heat 2 years ago, after the death of Trayvon Martin, they all pose wearing hoods over their heads, and they write Trayvon's name on their sneakers. I mean, they're not doing that so Nike puts out their commemorative Trayvon Martin shoe. You know what I'm saying? It's like they're doing it because they think, okay, we live in South Florida. That's where this happened. There had been, at the time, several dozen walkouts of South Florida high schools. We feel like we need to say something, that silence is not an option. And I think that's still, to this day, very, very powerful. And still, I think, something that I think scares people. Like in the suites of the NFL and the NBA, it scares people because part of what sports is like giving a platform and a microphone to a lot of people who, because of socioeconomic reasons, aren't usually given a microphone in our society. So when they use it, I mean, it can be very intense. But you're right, it comes with incredible risks at the same time. And you hear athletes say all the time about like, wow, what's the point of saying anything? And because oftentimes the media, I mean, my thing about the sports media is that it's like this 24-hour ravenous beast that's, so it's either, if you're an athlete, you either feed the beast or the beast feeds on you at all times. And like during the Super Bowl media week, you had that crazy kind of moment where Richard Sherman, cornerback for the Seahawks, was getting all kinds of crap because people said he talked too much. And then Marshawn Lynch got fined for not talking enough. And I'll never forget Melissa Harris Perry on MSNBC. She was talking about that, and she said, can't a brother just live? I mean, because it's like you talk too much, you get in trouble. You don't talk enough, you get in trouble. And it's like at times, it's like a lot of like people like Richard Sherman, to use an example, are just like, well, heck, if people are going to keep constantly putting a microphone in my face, I'm going to say something. Yes, sir.
Given the subject we're talking about today in terms of social injustice, looking at the higher propensity of professional athletes retiring, financially unstable, suicidal, or broke, where does the onus fall? Does it fall on the owners of these professional teams? Does it fall to colleges, colleges that are supposed to be educating our children? Or is it at the high school level where, say, like, for instance, one of these actual typing for the Patriots, but there was some trouble that he had.
Aaron Hernandez.
As well. So
yeah.
You have these different enablers, in essence, from high school up to professional ranks, that are not sitting these athletes down and encouraging them to do better, but just, as you say, feeding the beast and perpetuating the cycle.
No, and if people haven't seen it, there's a decent ESPN 30 for 30 called Broke, which is about athletes' propensity to go broke. And I went to one of the rookie symposiums once, one for the NFL and one for the NBA, and you're not allowed to report on what you see. I know you're familiar with these symposiums. And there's a section on finances at them where, it's like players can ask anything that they want. And the questions that are asked, it's like you could see the future going broke gonna happen in front of your eyes. Because it's just like, think about it. I mean, if you grow up and you have the tunnel vision that you're gonna play in the pros, and you think about the amount of hours that takes, the amount of dedication that takes to just get to that point. And then all of a sudden when you're 21, 22 years old, you're handed an incredible amount of money. I mean, what happens to that money? Especially if, according to the questions I heard, you don't know how a credit card works, you don't know how to balance a checkbook, you don't know how to write a check. You ask questions like, is it smart or not smart to put my family and to give my family power of attorney? Questions that are just like, wow, this is not going to end well. Particularly Because if, say, your career ends at age 26 and you already have payments out on houses, cars, whatnot, that require monthly payments, and then there's no more money, I mean, it's a bad story waiting to happen. So where does responsibility lie for that in our society? I mean, I think one thing that made me very happy to hear recently was there's a recent policy by the NFL Players Association where, and this is just one league, this is just one union, but I hope it's replicated because at least it's something, where it used to be if you wanted to fill out all this paperwork as an NFL player, you could have 5% of your check put aside for after you retire. And it's an opt-out thing that you could do. And a lot of players weren't even familiar with the program. Who wants to fill out a ton of paperwork? It was just something that was there sort of on the books. And the head of the NFLPA, DeMaurice Smith, in the last collective bargaining agreement, had that turned to be an opt-in program, which is the 5% is now taken out automatically no matter what, unless you want to fill out paperwork to keep your 5%. And I think that will at least help because, man, the current status quo of it is just, it's not good. And the leagues realize it's not good. I mean, but more from like a public relations perspective. But, at some point, it's like the idea of like active common sense intervention in kids' lives, particularly kids who are seen as meal tickets. I mean, it's not there. Is there? Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. Going forward, when you look at the career factor, there's a lot of athletes who are not going to go pro, correct?
Yes.
So when you look at coaches, when you see coaches going forward, focusing on, okay, once your program is over, how are we going to get an exit out of the world of sports? Because it's identity crisis, a lot of these athletes don't want to. I'm looking at my brother. He played for Cal Berkeley, he registered the first year. He got into the Fresno State. He was a blue chip All-American for California, so they're going to take him to another school. They're going to make sure that he takes the next level. However, he still didn't get his degree. Thank God he found a job in social services. But when he went to the combine, they said the fact that his back was hurt. So here's another black man, didn't make it. He dealt with the program, excellent. But it's something that really helped him to transition to that next level in terms of career, in terms of the next phase of his life. You're going to understand each other in our Pop Warner, looking at these coaches. It's like a Bible thing, but they steadily pumping the main agenda of go just play football, and nothing else. When is this culture going to change, starting from pop culture, Pop Warner, let them know that, look, you go to a D3 school, you may not make it. All right? Focus on your education. Okay? I'm not going to have you, lose your scholarship and then just, but that's what happens to a lot of our black girls. And I just really want to see that being infused early on before they get into this whole world to know that this is not the end all. Because a lot of our black girls feel like if they don't sell drugs, if they don't, there's no way out. So how can we help reverse that?
Yeah, the big question that was in there is when is it going to change? I definitely don't have an answer to that question, but I do want to recommend a book called Coaching for Life by a guy named Joe Ehrmann who used to play for the Baltimore Colts, EHRMANN. Just check him out if you haven't, because he was also the pastor for the Baltimore Ravens for many years, and he thinks about these issues just like constantly. And he's come to the conclusion that you have two kinds of coaches in this world. And he calls them either the transactional coach or the transformational coach. And the transactional coach, another way to say that is your typical coach. And the transactional coach is basically looking out for their own win-loss record, their own prestige, and their own next job, which is how typically the system is run. And the transformational coach, and there are not many of them, they do exist, and Joe profiles them, but it says something that, when he profiles them, it's like a special thing. You know what I'm saying? That it's not the status quo.
Right. You look at like Coach Carter, you have a movie like that, like the parents don't say he's changing, they can't play the defense, but you really see that. And it's over to the parents that you know, trying to do a good thing, but the students succeed.
Right.
That's simple.
Right.
That's
Right. No, we need more transformational coaches. We need coaches who are looking at, and basically what a transformational coach is this is not disconnected from the discussion about rape culture and violence against women. It's like the idea of There is sports culture as it exists in the most general sense. And in this most general sense, violence against women is not confronted, and coaches are transactional, not transformational. That's just the status quo. And it takes conscious actors, like actually seeing themselves consciously as using sports as a greater social good. Unfortunately, a lot of parents don't want to hear that either. It's like, okay, you're using sports as a greater social good. Well, what does that mean for my kid getting a scholarship? Which speaks to other questions about the pressures to actually get a scholarship, because college is so damn expensive in this day and age. So it's like there are a host of factors that are pressing down on sports. They're oftentimes some of the worst aspects of our society in the 21st century are just reflected in sports. And, so it takes, because it's a reflection of society, all the financial pressures, institutionalized racism, the idea of role models, all the things we can talk about. I mean, it's like inside sports, it has to be seen as just one arena where this is fought, not something that can then be a cure for these things that exist so far beyond the world of sports and athletics. Yeah, exactly. Bye. Have a good one. I'll just say. Yes. Is there any women? I can't really make and see gender because it's like shadowy. Are there any women with questions? I don't want to call on dudes. But if not, I'm happy to call on another dude.
I just have a general question.
Oh, sure.
You mentioned a lot of figures that sort of have stood out in regards to sort of sports and politics historically. And about a little less than a week ago, the 76ers retired the jersey of Allen Iverson. And it just made me think about him in terms of historically what did he mean in the same context as we sort of thought about things. And we've all sort of reflected on some of these older athletes. So I just want to get your opinion on what type of impact do you think Iverson had in terms of socially, politically, culturally, whatnot?
Well, first of all, I got to tell you, I'm a huge mark for Allen Iverson, so everything will be biased from what I say going forward. I once got to even play a little bit in a pickup game with him when he was at Georgetown back in '96, and you've never seen somebody 5'11", 160 pounds, just pinning people against the glass, and I mean, it was just like the craziest thing I ever seen. So big. I'm just like just aesthetically, I'm a huge Allen Iverson fan. I'm just putting that out on the table, and that may color some of what I'm going to say. I always believe that there are two kinds of athletes when we talk about political athletes. There's representational athletes, and then there's conscious actors. The representative athletes or representational athletes are people like Jesse Owens, for example, who it's not like Jesse Owens spoke out against Hitler. He didn't do that in 1936, but he did win 4 gold medals at the 1936 Olympics, which symbolically had a huge impact. That was a big deal. And conscious political athlete would be somebody more like Billie Jean King, who didn't only beat Bobby Riggs as a woman tennis player, but then also spoke out about issues pertaining to women's equality in sports. So it's like, it's not to judge which is more or less important, but it's a different kind of politics. And I always thought that while Allen Iverson was not so much of a conscious political actor, his representational politics cannot be overestimated. Because what he did was he brought a certain kind of hip-hop aesthetic and a certain kind of young man into David Stern's face and into America's living room. And it forced a very reactive response by David Stern. Like the reason why the NBA has a dress code is because of Allen Iverson. And the most evocative example of this, of course, was the NBA. They don't have it anymore, but they used to have their own magazine called, I believe it was called Hoops. And they had Allen Iverson on the cover, and they airbrushed out all his tattoos on his arm. So it's like all of those things are very important, because so much about what sports is about, like we live in sometimes a very cloistered and a very segregated country, and I don't just mean in terms of skin color, I mean segregated in terms of just the kinds of people that we know. And what Allen Iverson and what sports can do is it can break down some of those walls and introduce people to folks who you would not otherwise see or associate with or understand. And the thing about Allen Iverson, which was so amazing, was that he not only was like this, young man with cornrows and tattoos, somebody who had been through the criminal justice system for a crime that was racially related, that he was almost certainly innocent of. People might be familiar with his story from high school. But even beyond all of that, you had a situation of him being taken to heart in Philadelphia, which traditionally had not been kind to African American athletes. Seen as a white blue-collar town, the town that celebrates the statue of Rocky, a fictional boxer, but did not celebrate Joe Frazier, who was an actual boxer. The statues of Rocky, not Joe Frazier. And before Allen Iverson, it's, I can name other athletes too, like Dick Allen, for example, like Kurt Flood. I mean, you had these athletes who were strong African Americans who could not make a dent in Philly. And so, but Allen Iverson represented kind of like a shift, a changing of the tide, if you will. And I mean, like I said, I don't think it can be overestimated, like what he meant. And the fact that he left it on the court was pretty terrific. And the fact that he said things like, he was asked, his rookie year, he said, "Is Michael Jordan your hero?" And he said, "No, my heroes don't wear suits." And, we can like that or dislike that, but it certainly was something that made a lot of young people cheer when he said that. So it was bringing something that was very real and true in this country and putting it in people's living rooms. Yes, sir.
Just as an extension of your comment about the tattoos, recently the All-Star game, they crafted a jersey for the NBA players that was more like a sort of a tight t-shirt instead of a tank top. And some teams are already sort of transforming for the t-shirt, and there's speculation that they're trying to cover up all the tattoos.
Not surprising. I mean, there's a great book called After Our Test, which is about how the NBA, after what's called the Malice in the Palace, that was the brawl with the Indiana Pacers and the fans of the Detroit Pistons, that there's been a conscious effort. How do we market a majority African American league to a majority white country? Like, how do we do this? And David Stern was somebody who looked in every possible angle. The dress code was just one manifestation of that. It's I think you can never have a shortage of things to write about if you're talking about racial politics and the National Basketball Association. And what was great about Allen Iverson was that he forced a discussion that was happening behind closed doors out into the open, which is actually less representational and more conscious. So I go back and forth on that with him. Yeah, just because the gentleman there had his hand up for a long time, so.
Recently this come up. I want to get your thoughts on how NFL kind of penalized the use of the N-word. Your thought on that, with your background, with knowing all these historical figures.
Yeah, I've two thoughts on this. The first is that if the NFL cares so much about racial slurs, they should do something about the team name in Washington, D.C. I don't know why that's not priority one. The second thing to say about that is, I think that there are certain discussions that people who are not African American would do well to not have opinions on and to take a step back. I mean, it's obvious, very obvious, that there's a very real debate inside the African American community about the N-word. Can it be reclaimed? Can it not be reclaimed? Is it something that people should be all right with it being used as a term of affection or not? And that debate is very real. I have a problem with a league that has no African American owners, that the overwhelming majority of refs are white, in putting penalties down on how a majority African American league chooses to speak to one another. That I have a problem with. And I think that there is obviously, like I said, a real debate, and I'm not endorsing one way or the other on that because it's not my debate. So.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you.